smiling, laughing. Like to punch him in the face, I'll tell you.
The only way we create the change that we need is through a political revolution.
Well, whether either one of those two wins or not, I think we can all agree that both those two men have really shaken the world of U.S. politics up. But is it an isolated phenomenon, or could it spread? Has it already spread? Andrew's here in Toronto. Chantal is in Montreal, and Maclean's political editor, Paul Wells, is in Ottawa. I thought of this morning when I was watching former British Prime Minister Tony Blair on a U.S. channel. Here's what he had to say when he was asked to comment on the kind of leadership campaign that he's witnessed in the U.S. so far this year. Here's what he said.
What there is today are these great insurgent movements around individuals that gather immense momentum, carry people along with them. And, you know, on the left, they're very much the same type of themes that come out. We want a political revolution, we want this for free and that for free, and, you know, we want to shake up the elites and so on, all of which is completely understandable and comes from this deep sense of anger. The trouble is, in the end, in real politics, in real life politics, you need answers and not just anger. You need a plan.
All right, the point he was making was that this isn't just happening in the U.S. He's seeing it happening in other countries, and he was mainly talking about in Europe and in his own country. Is it happening here, Andrew?
I don't see any evidence of it. I mean, I risk being disproved by events, but we often exaggerate the differences between Canada and the United States, but there are nevertheless differences in the political culture at the best of times. We haven't gone through anything like the kind of serial traumas the United States has gone through, whether the financial crisis, the housing market collapse, Iraq, the terrorist attacks that they've had. We don't have 12 million illegal immigrants as a political flashpoint. So, you know, you can see how their anger could be building and people looking for scapegoats in the United States, and you can see the kind of extraordinary fluke of somebody like a Donald Trump coming along with both the resources and the shamelessness to exploit it. It doesn't mean that leaders don't matter and that a charismatic individual could arise in Canadian politics, but not of that kind, I don't think.
Well, if either one of these guys, you know, wins their nomination, our Canadian potential leadership candidates, Chantal, are going to be looking at this and saying, this is the winning formula now. This is the way to go. Yeah.
Well, not if they're speaking to ordinary Canadians from coast to coast to coast. Whenever I make a presentation over this presidential season, conservative rooms, more left-leaning rooms, the question always comes up, and it's not full of admiration, is this guy going to win? And you're not feeling any envy. It's not the Obama style, can we have our own Obama, can we have our own Trump? So no. I'd also, to add to Andrew's point, at this point, we don't have an angry constituency of the size of many of these countries. And we also don't have a party that caters to anti-immigration feelings. Every party, every major party in this country is heavily invested in winning votes in cultural communities. So I can't see it, no.
Paul?
Well, your first question, Peter, was could it happen here? Depending on your definitions of it and here, it's been happening here for a while. Rob Ford was the mayor of Toronto. Rachel Notley, I thought one of the most fascinating political events of last year was when the CEOs of 7 big companies in Alberta said, surely to God, you don't want to vote for the NDP. They're beyond the pale. They represent nothing that is serious and responsible. And the voters said, well, thank you very much for that opinion. We're going to do what we want. And Tony Blair knows whereof he speaks. He wrote a fascinating, actually quite touching op-ed piece shortly before his Labour Party chose Jeremy Corbyn as their leader. Blair said, I'm the most winningest leader the Labour Party has ever had. I had a bunch of policies that I thought moved this country forward, and now my own party doesn't want me. To some extent, it's becoming a fairly common phenomenon. In the last federal election, I mean, I'm going to get in trouble for comparing Justin Trudeau to Donald Trump, but in the last federal election was essentially a conspiracy between Tom Mulcair and Stephen Harper to defend what was to define what was irresponsible. Getting rid of the F-35s as a procurement option, sinking into deficit. They both said, "You can't do that, you silly kid." And the voters said, "Well, thanks very much. We're going to do what we want." I think there's a reluctance to listen to the same old opinion about what's responsible. And while it's true that Donald Trump is picking up a lot of essentially horrible voters, especially along the South, white supremacists out canvassing for him and things like that, a lot of the support is from basically ordinary people with ordinary opinions who wonder why they got walloped by the last decade and why nobody in a position of power seems to understand or care.
All right. It was interesting watching Chantal's face and Andrew's face while you were launching into that, because Andrew was giving you the nod of approval at some points, and Chantal was going the other way. So let's hear why, Chantal.
I can't see that parallel between going for Justin Trudeau and the Trump or the Labour Party leadership. The way voters react in this country is very middle of the road and actually fairly reasonable. I also don't see this large constituency that feels angry or left behind by the last decade in Canada. So all these conditions you listed kill your parallel, frankly.
Yeah. Well, but that's the fun of parallel, Chantal. I mean,
they're supposed to be straight lines that don't meet, not
absolutely,
lines that hit each other.
Maybe as the guest I can speak. I absolutely agree that the economy in Canada hasn't been nearly as bad as in the United States for the last decade, and that the phenomena we describe won't be as extreme. But I maintain that Rob Ford was the mayor of Toronto. I was there. I saw it happen.
Andrew.
I think the parallel is that orthodoxy or conventional wisdom can ossify. Even if I happen to support a lot of it, it has to be refought, those battles, over and over. And I think a lot of people who favor balanced budgets or free trade or what have you got lazy and flabby and thought that, well, this will just always be the argument. People will just obviously see the sense of it, and you have to keep winning that fight over and over again. The non-parallel is we threw out the angry guy. We brought in the guy who was the sunny ways guy. So there was similarity in the sense of he was overturning orthodoxies, but he was doing it in a much less angry way.
And conventional wisdom gets stale. Sometimes it's not applicable anymore, and we need to move past that. It's not that people forget why it is conventional wisdom, but because it's just not very relevant anymore.
That could also be
let
the
me
case.
ask the conventional wisdom question in terms of us, in terms of the media and the way we tend to look at what we think are qualified leadership candidates or leadership candidates who are likely to do extremely well, as the Americans did, you know, and kind of missed the boat. They called Sanders a write-off. It was never going to go anywhere. They thought Trump was a buffoon. And wouldn't go anywhere. They both come around on those things now. So what are the lessons, if any, for us in all of this, Chantal?
Well, I'm not saying the people on this panel, but a lot of pundits wrote off Justin Trudeau. A lot of us believed Stephen Harper would never be Prime Minister. The Conservatives were convinced Jean Chrétien didn't have a shot, so we do that too. And we rarely see change as an industry until it's staring us in the face. But we also sometimes contribute, and I would argue that what's happening in the US is also that the media is not given some of the candidates, Trump in particular, the kind of treatment they should or would have given a serious candidate.
You mean a tougher look?
Yes.
Yeah. The problem with a candidate like a Trump or a Rob Ford is not only did they violate all the conventional standards of do you have relevant experience, do you have any relevant or serious policies, do you understand the issues, do you know your facts, do you tell the truth, are you a person of good character, all those things that are conventionally assumed to be the things we look for in a leader. Not only do they not meet those standards, they simply blow through them, they defy them, they refuse to be held to them, they don't look guilty when they're caught lying, they don't, they just refuse to obey any of the normal standards, which is when you're caught doing something, you look guilty. If you're faced with that kind of shamelessness, it's very difficult for any of us to know exactly how to call them to account.
Paul.
My only advice to observers, and I don't have a sort of a perfect crystal ball on this. I wrote Donald Trump off long before writing Donald Trump off was fashionable, but it's always a good idea to have a measure of empathy for the people who support these folks. This week in the House of Commons in Britain, since we started with Britain, David Cameron, the Prime Minister, was very dismissive of Jeremy Corbyn, who's a funny-looking guy who's the Labour leader. He said, at one point he said, get a proper suit, do up your tie, and sing the national anthem. And all the Conservatives had a good laugh. Millions of Brits and millions of people around the world have been dismissed as snidely as that by people who look like David Cameron, and they often don't like it.
You know, just I watched that exchange, and it was quite something. To be fair to Cameron, I know that they were his words and they came from his mouth, but he was claiming that that's what his mother would have said, as opposed to what he would have said.
The trouble is, and Paul's point is well taken, the trouble is there's genuine snobbery, and then there's kind of this attitude that says that any attempt to hold anybody to any standards is just a bunch of elitist snobs. So people who defended Rob Ford, for example, had this vision of him, well, he's just this plain-spoken guy that the downtown elites don't like. I grant you that a guy like that, the downtown elites in Toronto would certainly look down their noses at, but he was not that guy. He was a guy who hung out with gangsters. So, and this is partly in the right-wing circles, they are reaping what they sowed with Donald Trump, because they've encouraged this attitude that everybody's out to get us, the media are out to get us, the academics are out to get us, the elites are out to get us, and so anything that they say must be discounted, and anybody that they're horrified by must be the guy that you want to vote for.
All right. In the couple of minutes we've got left, I know we talked about this topic last week, but we saw the report today on assisted dying, and we've seen the early debate surrounding it. The initial thoughts on it, Chantal, what are yours?
I think this is a report that the government must be happy about. It opens almost every door and allows the government to close some and look like it's come to a middle ground on medically assisted suicide. And it also bodes well for the legislation in the sense that the Conservative senators signed off on it, so did the NDP. There is dissent from Conservative MPs, but I think this sends a signal that it will be smoother sailing when it comes to a vote than many people expected.
Paul?
I think the government will be breathing a sigh of relief, because even that dissenting report from the Conservatives on that committee was fairly softly couched. It's not a fire-breathing how dare you. And so I think that the government will be able to proceed without too many further difficulties on this file.
And perhaps when they sense what the direction that report was taking, that's why they got out of the whipping of the vote idea, which we talked about last week. Andrew, I know you were in the budget lockup for the Ontario budget today, so you didn't have as much of a chance to look at this as our two colleagues, but what you have seen, what's your sense on it?
Well, from what I've read of it, it goes well beyond anything the Supreme Court actually ordered. The Supreme Court, it itself was inventive reasoning, but said it was going to be consenting adults in the last stages of a terminal disease, et cetera. This contemplates applying it to children, applying it to the mentally ill. There are none of the safeguards that the Supreme Court insisted on. And indeed, the Supreme Court dismissed arguments that said, look, this could lead to this. It has in Belgium. It has in the Netherlands. It said that was anecdotal. It said that was there were differing medico-legal cultures between the countries. People dismissed warnings of that as being slippery slope. Here we are several months later, and we have a parliamentary committee recommending exactly that. This is not, I think, what most people thought they were getting into when we opened this discussion. I hope and trust that when the final legislation was brought in, it is much more narrowly tailored than this.
And we should underline that fact, that this is just the report, it's not the legislation. We don't know where that will be. And if, in fact, it does go beyond what the court ordered, that may become, one assumes, a flare-up point in the debate around it. But as we've heard, the early reaction to it on Parliament Hill hasn't been overly negative. All right, thank you all, and Paul, as always, thank you for joining us. Paul Wells, Chantal's in Montreal, and Andrew here in Toronto. By the way, we want your questions for a special edition of At Issue. We'll all be in Vancouver next week for the First Minister's meeting, and as they meet on the future of the country, we want your questions on climate change, on the economy, on Indigenous issues, and on more. You can email us at thenational@cbc.ca, or post to our Facebook page, or tweet us using the hashtag @issue.